Hey everybody, welcome back to the American Songster Radio Show. This is your host Dom Flemons, and I'm here with my co-host Vania Kinard, and we're gearing up to talk with my friend Sam Bush. Well, let's welcome him onto the show.
Thank you, Dom. Good to see you.
Yeah, absolutely, man. It's been just wonderful listening to Radio John, and it gets me thinking back on a story that you were telling me when I had you appear on Traveling Wildfire with me with Guess I'm Doing Fine. You had told me that your dad really wanted you to play the fiddle.
If there was a fiddle, he wanted in on it. And I grew up a bluegrass fan. My father was a country music fan, and so obviously a big fan of the Grand Ole Opry. He grew up in Kentucky, so he had listened to Grand Ole Opry, from its get-go. And but he was a fan. The people he looked up to would have been Roy Acuff, Hank Williams, Patsy Cline, Cowboy Copas, Hawkshaw Hawkins, those people that,
okay.
And in one fell swoop, three of his main people that he loved to listen to were wiped out in a plane crash. But we later got to be friends with Roy Acuff and stuff. And in Mr. Acuff's dressing room, fiddle jams is what happened the entire time. And of course, he had one of the best fiddle players that ever lived, Howdy Forrester.
Wow.
But yeah, my dad, his dream job for me was the being the staff fiddler in the Opry house band, which I'd already turned my attentions towards elsewhere. But that would have been, that was the world he loved, was fiddle playing. And so, but he loved bluegrass music too, because there's usually a fiddle player in it. So he knew all the fiddlers and really. And then he had 1,000 fiddle albums. I swear, he loved fiddle playing.
But he never played though.
He did play. He just didn't do it in front of people.
Oh.
My dad would be the guy that would host the fiddle jam session. So we'd have like 2 or 3 fiddlers and a guitar player. My sisters were learning to sing, but I don't even remember there being singing at the jam sessions as I grew up. So it was like instrumental fiddle playing that he just loved it. He played the fiddle himself, but again, let me put it this way. He had a buddy once, and he said, Wayne, I hope you don't never die, because as long as you're alive, I ain't the worst fiddler in the world.
Well, that's amazing. And so he would take you around to the fiddlers conventions and things like that?
We went to certain contests, but really where he brought me where I learned the most was coming down to Nashville, Tennessee. And the first time we came down, he had befriended Jerry Rivers, who played the fiddle with Hank Williams, and Jerry was in a vocal trio called the Homesteaders, and they would play on TV in Bowling Green. There's a little station there. And but Jerry invited us down if you want to go backstage at the Grand Ole Opry. Well, of course we did. And so we came down, and the very first visit, we stopped in what was on Broadway between 4th and 5th Avenue, the Roy Acuff Museum and Exhibit place. And so it's where Mr. Acuff had so many accumulations over the years that he finally had to start his own museum. And so we walked in just, going to go through the Acuff Museum, and lo and behold, bashful brother Oswald was taking the door. So my stage dad had already told him about his boy that plays the fiddle. And so, much to my embarrassment, Oswald produces a fiddle and I play a tune. And then Oswald just got on the telephone there and said he had called Roy Acuff, and he goes, "Roy, you better get down here. We got a boy that can fiddle." And Mr. Acuff was down there within the half an hour. And so that night we actually got to go backstage and hang out with Mr. Acuff and Oswald. And I ended up playing, I guess, later that night on the Ernest Tubb Record Shop. Acuff was on that too. So he asked my dad, bring me over and we'll put him on the Ernest Tubb Record Shop at midnight. So it was a pretty surreal experience. And I remember at that night I got to Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys were there too, and so I got to stand in close proximity to Bill and the Bluegrass Boys, and I met the young guitar player Bill had that night, who was a guy named Peter Rowan, who Bill called Pete Rowans. So at any rate, that's how long I've gotten to know Pete Rowan.
Wow, that's amazing. Now, do you remember what tune you played for him?
I don't. It was probably my trick tune then was probably Black Mountain Rag.
Nice.
Open,
That's
open
amazing.
tuned A on the fiddle. That was, I mean, I was 14, I guess, 13 or 14.
Wow. So this has been it was in your blood at first, and then it just became a calling that's kept with you all this time.
It has, and one, music was encouraged in our household. We grew up on a farm, so our parents didn't want us to have to work as hard as they had, and none of us ever did. But maybe their farming, self-employed work ethic, got handed down to us. But another thing that happened early on was that I got to go to one of the first, it's arguably the first multi-day bluegrass festival called the Roanoke Bluegrass Festival, and it was in Fincastle, Virginia. And so I'd read about it in the folk magazine Sing Out. So this is 1965, and I was into folk music and just every kind of acoustic music. I was really into it. But in reading the ad in Sing Out for the Roanoke Bluegrass Festival, I realized that's where all the mandolin players were going to be. So my attentions were on mandolin and then fiddle, and it kind of always has been that way a little bit. But anyway, getting to go to Roanoke and seeing some of the masters, many of the masters of bluegrass at the time. The Stanley brothers were there. So I saw Carter Stanley, the original ones. Doc Watson was there playing by himself. Bill Monroe, of course, and the Bluegrass Boys, Jim and Jesse, the Osborne brothers. So it was really all the cream of the crop of bluegrass that I was getting to see. Reno and Smiley had already split up, but they were both there with their separate bands. And Ronnie Reno was playing mandolin with his dad, Don, and Ronnie was a crackerjack mandolin player. And I also met a person that we became friends for life, a guy from New Jersey named David Grissman. And so there was quite a lot of pickers that I met that were still pals, Tony Trishka and Andy Statman. And so it was a pretty eye-opening experience to get to see the real masters of bluegrass at work.
Wow, what a tight-knit community. Now, what year was that? That
was 1965, and they had two of them, and I got to go to both 65 and 66. But that was also first time I'd ever seen instrument workshops where so on the instructional side of it, in the instrument workshop was in fact Bill Monroe and Bob Osborne and Jesse McReynolds and David Grissman and Ronnie Reno. So I mean, and they're showing us how to play. So it was really a great experience that I got to go through there.
Oh, I can only imagine. So was it a true like teacher-student sort of thing, or was it sort of a thing where they would kind of play something and then have you play it back, or what sort of method?
They were just sitting on stage playing
okay.
on the main stage. So no, I'm sitting on a log out in the audience, but just a sponge for it. And one of the great things that happened is then 3-day festival. By Sunday afternoon, the way the festival ended was what Carlton Haney, who was from Virginia or Carolina, somewhere in there, they talked kind of like, they called it the bluegrass story. And it really did teach me about the fact that almost everyone on that festival had played with Bill Monroe when they were younger, except Jim and Jesse. So they kind of went through, and Clyde Moody, Bill's original guitar player in the Bluegrass Boys, was there that weekend as his own solo performer. So they really, kind of went through the history of Bill and his band, and all of a sudden, I didn't know that all these people had played with him until I saw that happen. So it was a neat piece of history that I got to see too, of how it sort of unfolded and who all played with Bill Monroe, and how you could trace the origins of bluegrass kind of back to Bill Monroe, or the Monroe brothers even.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, even with your own group of contemporaries, you've all sort of garnered that same sort of school of thought as well, I guess, in your own type of way.
Yes.
So, but it still goes back again to Bill Monroe and that original duo with the Monroe brothers, and then of course the Bluegrass Boys. So It's really interesting to see how that continues to be reverberations of music.
Yes, and it's it's wild to me that now we moved into, there's a young generation of listeners listening to bluegrass and a bunch of good young players. And one of the first one of the ones that comes to mind that's turning people on to these kind of sounds right now is, I guess, Billy Strings, and that Billy is, he'll vary his program, and one night he'll do a bunch of traditional tunes that this audience in a very large room has never heard. So he's really doing a lot to. I think it helps us all. It just helps us all.
I couldn't agree more. It was great to have him on the show last season, and it was really interesting. Even I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I was talking with Steve Martin last season, and he was telling me that one of the things that he notices about the young people that are coming into the bluegrass scene is he feels like the quality and the level of playing has gone up exponentially over the years, where a lot of the young guys are coming in and they have just a lot of skills coming in, and they're coming in with the full package. Is that something that you've noticed?
Absolutely. And the level of musicianship is rising, and on all the instruments. And it's because people like me, for instance, in learning guitar. Well, I had Doc Watson and Clarence White to look up to, and Dan Crary. On the banjo, things had gotten so progressive in the 60s with the album New Dimensions in Bluegrass Banjo with Eric Weisberg and Marshall Brickman. That got a lot of people thinking about new kind of banjo to play. Mandolin-wise, now there's, in the last 50 years, two of the main people that youngsters have been listening to are David Grisman and me. Mm-hmm. And so David and I, maybe we've had a hand in upping a bit of mandolin thing, because what we've done is learned Monroe style and Jesse McReynolds and then made our own. Yeah. So now the next logical step is fiddle players have had Mark O'Connor and the Mark O'Connor Camp, Kenny Baker, and you've had all these great people to spring forward from. So now the musicianship has just gotten phenomenally great. I mean, there's a bunch of young banjo players out there that, I would venture to say that Bela Fleck has been about the most influential guy of the last 20 years on three-finger Scruggs style banjo. And so the level of musicianship is growing. And of course, guitar-wise, the most influential cat of the last 50 years for me in bluegrass was probably Tony Rice. Yeah. And so again, now people have had Tony to learn from. So but the good part is, you still have, within the world of bluegrass music, you still have Del McCoury. And that, people it isn't just the progressive sounds, that people like Del are bringing maybe a new way to do what I think of as Bill Monroe style bluegrass. So the youngsters are growing up respecting the tradition that people like Del are still teaching you. And then maybe the, dare I say, newgrass style music that, that a bunch of us in the 70s, and many of us were doing this, trying to figure out ways to make bluegrass our own kind of sound as well.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, you've just recently gotten the induction into the Bluegrass Hall of Fame a second time now, not just as Newgrass Revival, but as a soloist now.
But as myself, which is pretty mind-blowing, really. I mean, someone asked recently, did you ever think that could occur? I went, well, no, there wasn't any such thing as far as a Bluegrass Hall of Fame. But, I mean, I would say you would feel the same way, too, that, when we started playing, when you learn to play mandolin or fiddle or acoustic guitar or banjo, we're not even, the thought of doing it on TV or something, that was never in our mind. It was just, you love the sound of that instrument and you're ravenous to learn more about it. And so I think, yes, to be in a Hall of Fame of any sort is, one, it meant you lived a long time, so that's been an accomplishment on its own. But it's pretty amazing to think that, that I have, if I've joined the ranks of others in the Hall of Fame. That's a pretty neat thing. And David Grisman and I are going in together this year.
Oh, so that's great.
And David was the first guy that ever let me play a Gibson F5 style mandolin. I was just a kid. I was 13, and I'm telling you about going to that festival, and I had a little shape like the teardrop shape of just A50 mandolin, and I always wanted to play the one with the points and the curls, the pretty one, right, like Bill Monroe had.
Yeah.
And when I was a kid, I would ask people, "Can I play your mandolin?" And they'd all say, "Nope." I get it, I understand. But I was in my first jam session at the Roanoke Festival, and all of a sudden, I was sitting in a circle. And we arrived at Roanoke, and it's it's 10 a.m. and there's a dozen jam sessions going on around this field. I've gone to heaven. I didn't know this existed, this world. And all of a sudden, this beautiful mandolin got lowered down into the circle, and I just heard this voice say, "Hey, man, play a good one." And it was the voice of David Grisman, and that's how we met. And the mandolin being lowered into my lap was one of the best ones I would ever hold, right? And so that's how I met David, and we've been pals all these years.
Wow, and that's amazing that you both are being inducted at the same time. That just really is a very special thing. It's great to know that these friendships have lasted so long, and that they traverse the stages of the United States as well as the world. It's really something.
Yeah, well, David was, of course, he lived for a very long time in California, now in Washington State. But if I'd go to the West Coast, if I'd go to the Bay Area, I was going to see David, and we were going to sit and play our mandolins together. And
wow.
And so it's pretty gratifying. Yeah, I love it that David and I are going in together.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, it's amazing to know that you have these wonderful friendships, and I guess that leads us perfectly into Radio John, the songs of John Hartford, which you just put out this year with Smithsonian Folkways recordings. And when did you meet John?
I met John in 1971 at Bean Blossom, Indiana. So it was up at Bill Monroe's Bluegrass Festival. The band I was in at the time, the Bluegrass Alliance, consisted of Courtney Johnson on banjo, Ebo Walker bass, Lonnie Pierce fiddle, Tony Rice guitar, and me on mandolin. And we were invited to play at Bill's Bean Blossom Festival. And, people think that Bill Monroe only liked traditional or the way he played it, and it really wasn't that way. He invited us up because we did play differently than other people. He wanted us to come present that kind of bluegrass to the audience, and it was already a departure from Bill Monroe's style. Well, also on that festival was John Hartford, who I had long admired growing up around Nashville TV. I saw him in the mid-'60s on probably one of these, on the Wilburn Brothers show perhaps, on a Saturday afternoon, seeing this guy play banjo and sing with this low voice. But I'd never seen anyone play a three-finger Scruggs-style roll and be able to sing at the same time. I didn't know that was possible. So there's the guy doing that. My first thought was, why doesn't he play guitar? But, well, he does play guitar and very well. But anyhow, but I didn't catch his name. I didn't know who that guy was. And it was later when my dad and I would be coming down to Nashville, we'd stop at the Ernest Tubb record shop, and I'd leaf through records and generally maybe buy a Bill Monroe record or but I was leafing through records, and all of a sudden, there's that guy. That's the guy I saw on TV. His name's John Hartford. Okay, cool. And the very first album I happened to buy did include Gentle on My Mind by John. I think it was this album called Earthwords and Music. And there's a couple of the tunes that I re-recorded for Radio John project that were on that record. A Simple Thing Is Love and No End of Love. And I just loved his songs. I loved his outlook. It was a whole different take on songwriting. Some of his songs would be so silly they'd be ridiculous. Some of them so beautifully, seriously written, and either these beautiful love songs or he wrote one song that I included on this package called California Earthquake. That that was going on in the '60s. People were predicting California was fixing to fall off the side of the country then, with the San Andreas Fault.
Yeah.
And so John was writing about all these things. But so I was well aware of him, and then all of a sudden, he's on He's on the Smothers Brothers show one night. You can look it up. Look up. I think it's 5 banjo players they had play on TV one night. Some of them I knew who they were, but there was a guy with dark hair, for instance, playing named Steve. Well, that was actually Steve Martin, who was so Hartford and Steve Martin and Mason Williams were comedy writers for the Smothers Brothers, and so then when Glenn Campbell got the summer replacement show, wow, there's Hartford on camera with Glenn Campbell. So then they would do a pickin' segment together. That was always a really great feature in that show. Just the two of them would sit. Maybe they'd have a bass player too. And so got to be really even a bigger fan of Hartford's. And but then in 71, Bill Monroe had booked John's band, we all refer to as the Aeroplane Band, to play there, and that was with Tut Taylor on dobro, Vassar Clements fiddle, and Norman Blake guitar and mandolin, and John, of course. And so getting to hear them in their height of when they had that great band together when John cut the Aeroplane album, that was really something. And they didn't carry a bass on the road with them. They just played the 4 of them. And then later that night, we got to talking after John played and our band, Bluegrass Alliance, played. And I got in a jam session that lasted about 3 hours with those guys into the wee hours of the morning around a campfire. And that's when I realized this Hartford guy, I've never met anybody that loved to play as much as him. That loved to jam as much as John Hartford. And so that was over the years in many a jam with Radio John, for sure.
Oh, that's amazing. And on this one here, one of the things that's so distinctive is that you're playing all the instruments on most of all the numbers, except for, of course, the title track, Radio John. What was your? Why'd you decide to do it with all just your own instruments?
Well, Lynn and I like to go to Florida, and when there's no work in like December and January, and so I always take some kind of little recording machine with me, and I was just trying to make some home demos for myself of these John Hartford songs to show the guys in my band, and that maybe we'd re-record them and make them better. Well, but I was having trouble with machines, and I couldn't figure it out what I was doing. I'm not a good engineer, and I have a friend named Donnie Sundel that owns a studio down there, and he's an R&B player, and I jammed with him the night before, and he asked, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm trying to make some tapes, but I don't know what I'm doing." And he goes, and Donnie owns a studio. He goes, "Oh, I'll come over tomorrow. I bet I know what to do." So Donnie came over the next day he brought all this stuff in his car, and he brought an entire Pro Tools recording rig with monitor speakers, mics, preamps, another bass, just all kinds of stuff. And so at that point, I started laying them down with a professional recording, and it was like, well, maybe I could make more out of this. Then 2020 hit and our lockdown, and I was able to just work with an engineer named Rick Wheeler, and we put quite a few hours in on it in 2020 because that's. So even though overdubbing with myself is not my favorite thing to do, I like to play with others. But I would at least have a bit of musical satisfaction that occurred in 2020. And so I ended up finishing all this stuff. And then John Pennell and I wrote one more song about John Hartford that we named it after his DJ name when he was a young man as a disc jockey in KSTL St. Louis. Radio John was what he went by. And if you look on the back of the first Newgrass Revival album cover, there's a poem written by a guy named Radio John, and it was hard. He was restricted in using his name contractually for other album liner notes, whatever. So there's a poem about the band, and it says Radio John, Topanga Canyon, 1972. So it was Hartford. Wow!
So it all comes back again. It just sort of like weaves into itself again and again. I just find that so amazing. You know, one of the things I noticed in a lot of the lyrics to the songs is a lot of them are about transitions or sometimes being hung up in where a transition takes you, like with tall buildings, or even with also I was finding with like Morning Bugle, I found that a lot of the songs are kind of like about transitions in these sort of ways where, you know, and you mentioned it, like you get hung up or you're trying to find out where your next venture is going to be. Was that something that you thought about when picking the songs out?
Honest, I'd love to say it was that thoughtful, but no, it was just the ones that I always just really loved. Again, I've never the song California Earthquake, that one just, when I was a kid, that just like spooked me, wow, this big earthquake could happen. But especially the love songs, A Simple Thing Is Love. I mean, John says a phrase in there, without you, I'm a child that sucks the vacant thumb of emptiness, left crying when he has not had enough. What? You're what? And then right down to the silliness of I was on the original recording when John recorded in the 70s, one called Granny, Won't You Smoke Some Marijuana? And, and at the time I'm thinking, John, that's got to be about the stupidest song you ever wrote. And here I ended up playing it with him all these years, and it became a fun tune to play. And it's so funny that in the 70s, John wrote a lyric that said, well, I used to get high and listen to the Beatles. Ain't this much fun now that it's legal? What was it, 40 years away from being legal? 50?
Yeah. I was going to say, it was like predicting the future. I thought you had actually written a new verse for that because of this, but that's what John wrote.
That was John's. And but I did get to record a few of those, and the couple of there's two instrumentals on there, and both of them I did record with John for his Flying Fish records, and I just made them a little different. But it's funny you mentioned Morning Bugle. I've heard Eve O'Donovan sing that song. She does a beautiful job of it. But I'm not really the song Morning Bugle. I just found it gave me comfort, and it's hard to describe. I mean, we've all had songs that, and especially maybe in 2020, I found myself finding more songs that gave me comfort and helped me, through an odd. I think a lot of people did that. Had songs they could gave them comfort.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I got to thinking about it as well, with a song like Down, which is one that I'm featuring on the musical segment of the program. Maybe if you could tell me a little bit about Down, and because I noticed that the song structures of some of these tunes are very different or very atypical song structures. Like Down, I was like, it sort of like had me constantly guessing about where the chord changes were going to lead, which was very exciting.
That's kind of how it felt when we recorded with John, too. But, and on Down, actually, it was one of those things where, as I worked with Rick, the engineer, that all of a sudden I went, you know what? We need to make this tune longer. So we took part of the rhythm section, edited in another section for another fiddle and banjo solos on it. And again, we're probably one of the things I worked hardest on was banjo picking, because I used to play the banjo a lot when I was a kid, but just haven't for a long time. And boy, that banjo or fiddle, those are two of the great humbler instruments to me.
Yeah, I mean the fiddle's the humbler for me. I've tried one or two times to make a sound out of it, but never happened.
Yeah, it's. I'm glad I started on mandolin, because at least I could see where the notes were with a fretted instrument. So I don't know how you just start out of the middle of nowhere. If violin was your first instrument. I know many people do, but for me, that would have been a lot harder.
Well, a question I asked Billy Strings about was, I asked him, I said, when you're soloing, what goes through your mind when you solo? Are you thinking of the scales that you're playing when you're soloing, or is it just a feeling, or what goes through your mind when you're just dreaming out there into the atmosphere?
I finally did learn a number of years ago to be able to think, especially when you're playing in an improvisational setting, to think a little bit ahead of where you are, but not too much, because really I've always kind of been this way, in that if I'm taking a solo and everything's going well, I don't think I'm really thinking about anything except the notes that are coming out right then. So if everything's going good, I'm not thinking very much. If I'm really straining my brain, it's probably not going that well.
Well, hey, that's a great way to be. Well, I guess we're getting close to the end of our time that we're able to sit together. Well, I mean, what's something that you could say about bluegrass as a community? Because, of course, it's one of those things that people ask me all the time, like, how can you go to a bluegrass festival and be there all day for the entire weekend? How can you listen to so much bluegrass all at one time? I mean, I love it. Like back before I was touring, I'd go from whatever it was, if it was 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., I was there all day long, all 3 days. Like, what is it that pulls that love of the music in, and what does it say about the community of bluegrass?
Well, I think part of it revolves around that when, especially growing up in my generation, which, I was born in 52, by the time I was rolling around there and getting to get out and play music, there was a feeling of camaraderie amongst those of us that were aware of bluegrass, and it was kind of a small club to be in. And so I think we all felt like we kind of knew about something that was just ours and our music. And then as we became professional musicians, especially in the 70s, of course, I think part of it was a feeling that really just came from, honestly, that came from the music of the 60s and the togetherness that people were having as far as maybe loving each other, that came from the San Francisco movement, the whole thing. But bluegrass kind of had that too, and those of us that became professional musicians in the 70s, we were pals. We were all playing on the same festival. We were pulling for each other. Mm-hmm. And that the bluegrass musicians who were already established, like the Osborne Brothers and Jim and Jesse and the Country Gentlemen and the Dillards, they were very encouraging to us and encouraged us, because we were the opening band on these for a lot of these people. Mm. So they always encouraged us, and so there was this there was a feeling, and there still is in the world of bluegrass style music, that we're pulling for each other. I don't see it as a competition amongst groups or any sort of jealousy or any of that kind of thing. I see it more of us all pulling for each other, and that we're all happy for each other, that we all got a job, and that we get to work at the same festival. So I really think, and I think that has something to do with the fact that when you grew up playing acoustic music, that we have the freedom to just sit in a circle in any building or under any tree and just start playing. We don't have to have a production. We don't have to plug anything in. I mean, you can do that if you want to play on stage, what have you. But I think it had something to do with being in the camaraderie of a jam session and jamming together, and maybe other kinds of musics. Just, logistically, you can't do that as well as those of us that grew up around acoustic music, that we get to sit in a circle and jam, and we still do.
That's amazing. Well, I was really fortunate to have you guesting on the Traveling Wildfire album, Guess I'm Doing Fine, a Bob Dylan number, and I kind of changed it around a little bit to sort of give it more of a bluegrassy feel. Do you have any thoughts on when I sent down the track? What did you think of that number?
Well, I went, whoa, where'd this come from? Who wrote this? Who wrote this? Oh, it's a Bob Dylan tune? Okay, great. That makes more sense. But no, and also on I'm Doing Fine there, it's got like, what's interesting to me is where you might have an extra little phrase or an extra little beat or something every once in a while. Well, that's particularly interesting to me, so I was in.
Oh, nice. And I mean, you put a great fiddle part on there. I really, really appreciate you doing that for me. And I guess since I got you here with the fiddle, it'd be great to play a number with you if you didn't mind.
Well, certainly. I got the old red fiddle here.
Well, is there one that you think would be good? I got my bones here. I'll just jump right in with you, whatever you play.
Well, we had talked about, mentioned my dad and his love of playing, and so here, I guess his favorite tune in life. Well, any fiddle tune in the key of C. He loved any tune. At one time, John Hartford said that he thought that my dad was the foremost authority on fiddle tunes in C. So everybody knew my dad. They knew Charlie Bush loved fiddle playing, and yeah, if it was in C, he loved it. So this one's a C, and but this one I would have first learned from the great Grand Ole Opry fiddle player Tommy Jackson. And Tommy made fiddle albums, and my dad had these fiddle records before I ever, listened to bluegrass. So I I first started playing mandolin and fiddle along with these Tommy Jackson records. That led me to bluegrass because that's where the mandolin players were. But so there was always a mandolin player on the Tommy Jackson records, and so and my dad had 78s of Tommy Jackson. So there was. That's why they called them albums. There were 5 78s in a jacket with 5 sleeves that folded up like a photograph album. Mm-hmm. And so I'm under the understanding that's why they called them albums. So he actually had albums by Tommy Jackson with 5 78s, and on one of those 78s would have been this tune called the Tennessee Wagner.
Nice.
Okay. Now if I can get it there with you.
Well, thank you, Sam.
Thanks, Dom. Appreciate being here.
Absolutely. Well, that was Sam Bush here, and we're here with our very first in-studio musical performance here on American Songster Radio. It's just been wonderful to have you on the program, Sam Bush. Thank you again, and thank you for this wonderful album paying tribute to John Hartford.
Thank you, Dom. Appreciate being here. Thank you.
Well, folks, thanks for tuning in, and special thanks to Sam Bush for joining us in a great conversation. Thank you all for listening to American Songster Radio Season 4. We have more music coming up on the next episodes, and we'll get a chance to hear songs from my new album, Traveling Wildfire. Until then, you can stream all the episodes online at WSMradio.com, and you can listen to the full-length episodes on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, so don't forget to stay connected. Lastly, make sure to check out my website, theamericansongster.com, for my tour and project updates. Don't forget to follow me at Dom Flemons on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and all of your favorite streaming platforms. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel, follow my Spotify playlists, order merch from my online store, and send me an email with all your comments and questions to theamericansongster@gmail.com. Plus, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to WSM Radio so you can get more updates on the next episode. Well, thanks again, folks. You've been listening to Season 4 of American Songster Radio Show on WSM in Nashville, Tennessee. Catch you all next time. I'm Dom Flemons, the American Songster.